Good morning, Year 11. So, just wanted to carry on with our evolution topic today. I'm going to carry on by talking about another scientist called Alfred Wallace. Now, we've done Charles Darwin, we're doing Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, we've just done Lamarck in the last lesson, and now we're going to move on to Alfred Wallace. So, what we're going to do, I'm going to ask you to have a go at this starter question here. And this is something we're going to do a lot of because basically the main point of this topic is being able to explain how various scientists, mainly Darwin and Lamarck, would say that evolution happens. So there's two questions here. I'd like you to write them out in full in your books and with the work you're uploading, please. So there is, how would Darwin say the elephant got its trunk? And how would Jean-Baptiste Lamarck say that the elephant got its trunk? So pause me, this should take you about 4 or 5 minutes, I reckon. Fine, so hopefully everyone got the idea of Darwin, and this is the main one we have to get. Darwin would say that every now and then elephants are born with mutations which cause them to have longer trunks. So if we go back in time, you could find an animal that wasn't an elephant, a strange horse thing, which was born, one of its children was born with a mutation which caused it to have a little stubby trunk. Okay? So that first step is always mutation. And that led to variation, the trunk thing. Now you then have to explain how that would cause it to survive better or have more offspring. So you could say maybe with its little stubby trunk thing, it's able to move things around, it's able to pick up things a little bit, whatever it might be. But in some way this trunk is relatively useful. And so it survives longer and it has more offspring. And in actual fact, it outsurvives its relatives who don't have little stubby trunk things. And it has more offspring, and it passes on the allele for the weird stubby trunk thing to its children. That's a key point. And that each of those children which has a stubby trunk would also outsurvive their relatives. And so eventually there'll be a lot of stubby trunked children around. This is called survival of the fittest because these stubby trunked elephants will be more fit and more adapted to their environment, and so they will survive and they will have offspring and their relatives will die. Therefore, eventually every elephant in an area will have a little stubby trunk. And then one day another elephant is born of the stubby trunked ones with an even slightly longer trunk because of another mutation, and this repeats over time. How would Lamarck say the elephant got its trunk? Well, we're looking at something very different there. Lamarck would say, well, maybe this elephant is constantly stretching for leaves, or maybe it's using its nose for something like drinking water through it, some strange animal. In any case, it's using its nosed area repeatedly. And therefore, when its children are born, it's born with a slightly more developed nose thing. And basically, each generation, they use the trunk a lot. And so it gets bigger and bigger in the next generation. Because he says that whatever you acquire during your life, you pass on. So if you have a part of your body you use a lot, you pass on a more advanced version of that part of your body to your offspring. Fine. Hopefully you've got that idea. Now today we're going to talk about Alfred Wallace. I'm going to talk about the impact of his ideas on biology. Now this is another scientist. There's 4 we need to know for this topic: Darwin, Lamarck, Wallace and Mendel. And this is the most interesting story in my opinion. So, the first thing to start off with, before we do anything else, is the idea that this is the man who came up with the theory of natural selection. So what's this man's name? And if I said that to most people on the street, particularly people who don't know what Darwin looks like, they would say that is Charles Darwin, because they know Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection. That is not Charles Darwin, that is a man who is said called Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, he was a very well-respected gentleman at the time, and he came up with the theory of natural selection at exactly the same time as Charles Darwin. I'm going to look through that in just a second. So, he independently came up with a theory of evolution by natural selection, and incidentally you should be writing these down because you have to know what he did. And he published papers with Darwin, which basically worked together with Darwin to flesh out their ideas. So he worked with Darwin, but it's a well-known fact that he came up with the idea of natural selection independently of Darwin. And it's only after they both published their research on natural selection they started working together. So, let's have a look at his life, and pause me if you haven't got down these notes. So, let's have a look. Now, in order to have a look at his life, we're going to watch a little documentary, just 5 or 6 minutes, I think, by David Attenborough on this man. And what I'd like to know is the answer to these 4 questions. I think the best way to do this is to write down these 4 questions now. I will then play you the video, and I would like you to answer the questions as you go along. So if you'd like to pause me and write down these questions, then we'll watch the video as soon as you're done. Fine. So let's have a look at this video then. I'm going to play it. If it doesn't come out the speakers, if somebody could let me know on Teams, I'll send people the link.
I had found it. A perfectly new and most magnificent species, and one of the most gorgeously coloured butterflies in the world. The beauty and brilliancy of this insect are indescribable. I had found it. Butterflies in the world. The beauty and brilliancy of this insect are indescribable. The Malay archipelago was an
So, let's have a look at these questions then. If you haven't managed to complete them, just pause me now. So, Alfred Russel Wallace, an amazing man, a really brilliant scientist, and a very interesting life. Very obsessive about particular things. Beetles, for instance, is the main thing. But he came up with a lot of very interesting scientific theories, and we're going to look at a different one after we finish with the natural selection one. So, had Darwin not been around, had Darwin not existed, had Wallace sent his letter to somebody else, we might today be remembering Wallace as the father of natural selection rather than Darwin. Darwin just happened to have a fuller idea of it, to have thought of it for longer, and to have written it down better than Wallace did, and so that is the reason he has been selected as the person for which natural selection is being named. Now, what was Alfred Russel Wallace most interested in? Beetles and other insects is the main thing. What made him come up with the idea of natural selection? Well, you could put it several ways, but largely a trip to the Malay archipelago in which he observed various different species. And you can even then go into this story about the malaria fever, if you like, and having that kind of that fever dream of this idea. But really, it was the amount of different species. It's very much the same thing as Darwin. He'd been around the world. He'd seen multiple different species, all very similar, but with slight differences. And what he thought, why would this happen? How did Darwin find out? Well, Russel Wallace wrote to him and gave him this idea. He said, can you please have a look at this? Can you think of a way of getting this published for me? And what happened as a result of this? Well, they both published at the same time. They were both read out at the Linnaean Society. You don't need to know that name, obviously. It's just a very famous scientific society full of famous scientists. In order that both of them would get credit. Fine. So, Darwin tends to get natural selection. That's kind of his thing he's been given. Wallace is more remembered for a different theory, his idea on speciation, and it's very linked together. Now, speciation is how new species can be created from natural selection. It's an extension. It's another extra little bit. It's a booster pack, if you like, to the set of cards. It's important, though. And the way he did this was by studying butterflies. And to kind of analyse this, we're going to look at an exam question. We're going to work through it together. And that's going to hopefully help you to understand what he means. So there are two butterflies here. All right? There are two butterflies here. Both of them can be eaten by most birds. Right? Now, Amauris has a foul taste. Hypolimnus doesn't have a foul taste. Right. Now the question is, why do birds not prey on hyperlimnus? Now, I'm hoping everybody can immediately come up with the idea that they look similar, that the birds might think that hyperlimnus are amalris, that birds might get used to the idea that amalris taste horrible, and therefore they might not eat the hyperlimnus. That's a nice straightforward idea. And so immediately you could start to think, well, what's going to happen is, by natural selection, all the hyperlimnus that look most like amalris are going to survive, and all the hyperlimnus that look least like amalris are going to get eaten. And so what should happen over time is that hyperlimnus look more and more and more like amalris. And if you're thinking a bit further, you might even go so far as to say, well, maybe it might be in amalris's benefit not to look like hyperlimnus, because if hyperlimnus tastes good, birds might learn that those ones taste good and start eating amalris by accident. So you might think that amalris might actually start looking less and less like hyperlimnus. We're kind of this race where hyperlimnus tries to look more and more like amalris, and amalris more like hyperlimnus. Now, let's imagine instead that there are 2 poisonous butterfly species and 1 non-poisonous butterfly species. The question then is, we've got this middle one which is non-poisonous incidentally, and the one on the edges are poisonous. What will happen if the one in the middle has a child, an offspring, that looks a little bit more like the one on the left? Hopefully everyone can start to think again, like we just said. That's going to live longer, isn't it? It's going to live longer. And what about the one on the right? Well, if one is born that looks a bit more like the one on the right, that will live longer too. So what should happen over time is the question. What should happen over time is that the one in the middle stops looking like the one in the middle, and that about half the ones in the middle end up looking like the one on the left, and half the ones on the middle end up looking like the one on the right. Because every time one is born that looks like one of the poisonous species, it will live, and anytime one is born that doesn't look like the poisonous species, it will be eaten. And so, what will happen? Well, eventually you'll end up with 2 separate species. Why? Well, a species is a group of organisms that cannot breed together. Sorry, that can breed together. And what makes you different to another species is that you cannot breed with another species to produce fertile offspring. So, for instance, cats and dogs are different species because if you could get a cat and a dog to mate, they couldn't produce a baby cog or dat. Even lions and tigers are different species because whilst you can make a liger, it will be infertile. It won't be able to have its own children. And so only offspring that are fertile count, and so they're not the same species. And the reason is because their DNA is dissimilar, it's not the same. What will happen is, if you keep getting mutations to these things that make them look more and more like the ones on the left or the right, their DNA will slowly change over time. The ones on the left will change their DNA to look more like the ones on the left, the ones on the right will change their DNA to look more like the ones on the right. Eventually their DNA will be so dissimilar, because they're having to change themselves to look like the poisonous species, that they will be unable to breed anymore. Let's think about this in a different way. I'm going to get you to do these 4 questions. Now, have a look at this. It's about tortoises. It's very similar. Can you have a go at answering these 4 questions for me? Just pause me. So, variation that would help them to get food on the ground. Well, short legs being close to the ground, thin shells on the bottom to allow them to get close to the ground as possible. So you have to continue to bend down. If you imagine you're a tortoise, you've got your little shell bit under here. You don't want to have to kind of crane your neck. You want to be as close to the ground as possible. That's why we have these kind of flat pancake tortoises. Variations to help you to get food in the trees. Long legs, long neck, big and tall, able to stand on their back legs to kind of put their feet on the trees. Now, if all the food is either near the ground or high up the tree, any tortoises that stay as they are at present will be outcompeted. Survival of the fittest. they won't survive. Because there will always be some short tortoises who can get to the food on the ground quicker, little stubby legs. There will always be some tall tortoises who can reach the trees. The ones in the middle, they got nothing, and so they will die over millions of years. But over the course of millions of years, what will happen is we will end up with a whole group of very small tortoises and a whole group of very tall tortoises. Will they be able to breed with each other? Probably not, because the short tortoises have have alleles for short legs, thin shells, short necks, maybe teeth for eating whatever food might be on the ground. So their DNA will be very different to the tortoises that are very tall, with their long legs, thick shells, long necks, and all of that. Their DNA will be so different that even if they could breed, and you've got to think about the feasibility of that actually breeding, they probably wouldn't. So you'll have two separate species. And this is how speciation is supposed to occur by natural selection. That because of various different things within the environment, organisms adapt to fit into different niches. And one type of the organism might adapt to do one thing, and one type of the organism might adapt to a different thing. Take humans as an example. Let's say that we are adapted from apes, primitive chimpanzees. Well, maybe, half of those primitive chimpanzees became modern chimpanzees, so they became very good at climbing trees, catching other monkeys and eating them. Fruit. And they got all their adaptations which chimpanzees have. And half of them became the modern humans. Big brains, able to handle tools, stay more on the ground. But any ancient chimpanzees that stayed as they were, less good at climbing than chimps and less good at thinking than humans, will die. And eventually we get to the point where chimps and humans cannot mate anymore, because we're so dissimilar in our DNA. Fine, let's have a look at a final question. I expect to see this on your notes incidentally when you hand them in. So give that a read and then pause me. Right, so they put two types of shrimp together, shrimp A and shrimp B, and the two types of shrimp snapped their claws aggressively at each other and they didn't mate. That was evidence for the shrimps being classified as different species. Why might that be correct? Well, species have to be able to mate together. They didn't mate, and so they might not be species. Two reasons why it might not be correct. Well, they might be... Oh, to be fair, I haven't given you time to do these ones, have I, gents? I apologise. Pause me and do these questions. There's a 2 marker and a 6 marker. Right, let's go through the answers now. 2 reasons why they might not be correct. They might be the same gender for a start. That might be why they snapped each other. They might be exactly the same species. They might just both be males. One of them might be too young or too old to mate, and therefore they didn't mate. Might not be mating season. Anything that would otherwise cause them not to mate. They might be the same species. They might just happen not to want to mate for one reason or another. And then the 6 marker is the most important one. A narrow strip of land which today joins North America and South America, formed by land moving up beneath the sea. Panama has been separated from the Pacific Ocean for the past 3 million years. Separate the Pacific from the Caribbean. Explain why 2 species of pistol shrimp could have developed from an ancestral shrimp. So, there are some key marks here. The first is to say that they will be geographically isolated from each other. They won't be able to get together. They'll be separate. So they won't be able to breed or mix their DNA. The second thing to say is that there's probably different conditions in the Caribbean to the Pacific. So different food, maybe, different temperatures, different types of seawater, whatever it might be. So, and then you just launch into natural selection. In each group, there will be mutations, which lead to variations and adaptations to their environment, which allow them to survive and have more offspring, and are passed on to their offspring, and so that eventually, sixth mark, they will be too dissimilar, their DNA will be too dissimilar to breed. So, geographical isolation, different conditions, they each have mutations, they each have variations that allow them to survive or breed better, and eventually their DNA will be so dissimilar because of those mutations they can't breed together anymore. Whenever we're thinking about speciation, we're thinking about mutations going so far that you can't breed together anymore. Okay, hopefully that's straightforward for you gents. We will be going through some more of this again next lesson, so please don't worry if you haven't got all of that. And the basic ideas I need you to get are, who's Alfred Russel Wallace, what did he do? And he came up with this theory of natural selection and this theory of speciation. And then to have this general idea of what a species is, a group of organisms that can breed together to produce fertile offspring, and how we might go about getting a new species by natural selection. Hopefully that's been straightforward, and I look forward to seeing you all whenever we are able.